They told her the funeral was for family only, until a young soldier stepped forward and revealed the truth. It was a grey Saturday morning in Mobile, Alabama. The air was thick with heat and silence. Outside the white steepled church on Dauphin Street, rows of black cars lined the curb. Flags fluttered weakly at half-mast. People stood in clusters, dressed in dark suits and polished shoes, murmuring in soft tones. It was the funeral of Sergeant Michael Landry, killed during a mission in Iraq 3 weeks earlier. A woman approached the front gate slowly, her steps measured, as if she were walking across broken glass. Her name was Evelyn May Carter, 76 years old. She wore a modest black coat, one that had seen better days, and in her hand was a single white rose. Not a bouquet, just one. She didn't expect a welcome party, but she sure didn't expect this. Before she could even make it up the short path to the church, a man in a navy blue suit stepped in front of her. He had a clipped moustache, aviator sunglasses, and the look of someone who thought he was doing something important. "Ma'am," he said, keeping his voice down but firm. "The family asked for this to be a private service." Evelyn looked at him, confused. "Private?" He nodded once. "Family only." For a second she thought maybe she'd heard wrong. She looked past him at the open doors of the church. She could see the edge of the flag-draped casket, the ushers, the flowers. A few people glanced over. Most looked away. "I was close to Michael," she said, barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry, Ma'am," the man said again, taking a half-step forward. "We've got strict instructions, only family." There it was again. That word, family. Evelyn didn't argue. She didn't cause a scene. She simply tightened her grip on the rose and nodded. Her lips trembled, but she forced them into a straight line. With one slow breath, she turned around. And just like that, the crowd returned to their whispering, but behind her calm face was something else. A pain she'd swallowed too many times before. A feeling of being invisible in a place where her presence should have mattered more than most. She took a few steps down the sidewalk, moving past the glossy cars and stiff black umbrellas. She didn't even realize her legs were shaking until she had to stop at the corner to steady herself. A woman in a dark dress stared at her for a moment, then leaned in and whispered something to the man next to her. "Who was that?" he asked. "No idea. Probably confused," the woman said, adjusting her sunglasses. Evelyn heard them, but she didn't turn around. She wasn't confused. She was forgotten. 50 years in this town. 42 years in the same worn apartment on Jefferson Street. 22 of those years spent helping raise other people's children while working nights at the hospital. Michael wasn't just a neighbor's kid. He was hers in every way but blood. She remembered the day he was born. His mama was just 19 and barely scraping by. By the time he turned 4, Evelyn was picking him up from daycare twice a week, then 5 times, then every day. She kept an extra toothbrush for him, cooked for him, prayed for him. And when his father died in that car wreck on I-10, it was Evelyn who rocked him to sleep, who taught him that crying didn't make him weak, that good men don't disappear forever. They live in how you carry their name. But none of that mattered now. To the man at the gate, she was just an old woman with a flower and no last name to match the headstone. But as she took one last look over her shoulder, someone else noticed her. And it wasn't just anyone. Private Deshaun Briggs had arrived just minutes earlier, barely on time. He was still adjusting to civilian clothes, but for this, he wore his uniform. His mother had pressed it the night before, even though he could have done it himself. She said, "When you wear that, people see more than just you." He hadn't really understood what she meant until today. He stood near the back, away from the front pews. His eyes scanned the crowd without really seeing it. He had only met Sergeant Landry once, briefly overseas. But what the man had done that day, saving 3 soldiers including Deshaun, had left an imprint. He didn't know Michael Landry's family, didn't know his past, but he owed his life to the man in that casket. That was enough reason to show up and stand still. And that's when he saw her, an older black woman walking slowly away from the church, her back straight, movements careful. She held a white rose like it was made of glass. Deshawn blinked. He hadn't seen her face yet, but there was something familiar about the way she moved. Something gentle, but proud. Then she paused at the corner and tilted her head, just a little. That's when it hit him. His stomach turned. He knew her. Back when he was 10, his mother worked double shifts at a diner downtown. There were long stretches when Deshawn had to be watched, fed, kept out of trouble. That's when Miss Evelyn had stepped in. He remembered her cornbread, the way she ironed his school shirts, the way she never called him dumb when he struggled with reading. She'd just tap the book with her finger and say, "Try again, baby. Sound it out." But what really stuck was the way she talked about Michael. "Smartest boy I ever knew," she'd say. "And kind, too. He don't talk much, but he got a good heart." At the time, Deshawn had been jealous. He thought she favored Michael. Maybe she did, but even then, he knew she loved both of them. And now she was walking away like a stranger. He pushed through a cluster of people and moved fast, nearly knocking over a folding chair. His boots struck the pavement loud enough to make heads turn. "Miss Evelyn!" he shouted. She stopped. Slowly, she turned. When she saw his face, something shifted in her eyes. She didn't smile, not right away, but her shoulders eased, like a weight dropped from them. "Deshawn?" she asked, her voice low. "Yes, Ma'am," he said, already coming closer. "It's me, Deshawn Briggs, from Belvedere Street." Her mouth opened just slightly, and this time she did smile. Not a big one, but real. "You got tall," she said. He gave a quiet laugh. "You told me I would. You said I had long legs even when I was small." She nodded once, almost as if she were checking a fact in her head. Deshawn looked past her toward the church. Did they turn you away?" "They said it was for family," she replied, her tone almost apologetic, as if she were explaining someone else's mistake. He clenched his jaw, then turned to face the people gathered outside. Some had noticed the exchange. Most hadn't. "You coming with me?" he said. Evelyn shook her head slightly. "Don't want to cause no trouble?" Deshawn looked her straight in the eyes. "You already caused something. You made Michael who he was. You were his people. If they don't know that, they need to." He didn't wait for permission. He offered his arm. At first, Evelyn hesitated, but then she looped her hand through his elbow, the rose still in her other hand, and together they walked back toward the church steps. Inside, the choir had started humming. Michael's mother sat stiff on the front pew, flanked by 2 church elders. She turned slightly when she saw Deshawn coming in, then froze when she noticed the woman beside him. One of the ushers rose to intercept them. Deshawn raised his hand, not aggressively, but with intention. "She belongs here," he said clearly. "More than most of us." People started to turn. Heads swiveled. The murmurs began again. Evelyn stood quietly, not saying a word. She looked at the floor, then at the casket. Her eyes softened. But what Deshawn said next, he didn't plan it, didn't rehearse it. It just came from the heart, and it broke the room open. Deshawn didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The silence inside the church made every word land sharp and clean. "You all have no idea who this woman is," he said, looking straight ahead. Some people shifted in their seats. One man near the aisle coughed quietly. Deshawn went on. "I'm not here to start nothing. I'm just telling you the truth. If not for her, I wouldn't be here. And neither would Michael." That name, that one name, seemed to hit harder than the rest. A few people looked at Evelyn now. Really looked. Not like she was some random face that wandered in, but like maybe there was something they missed. Deshawn turned to her. "You want to tell them, Miss Evelyn?" But she shook her head gently. "No, baby. You say it." He nodded. So he did. "I was 10 when I met her. I barely knew how to stay out of trouble. My mom worked late, sometimes left me with folks who didn't care. But Miss Evelyn, she cared." He turned to the front of the church again. "She used to make a plate for Michael every night when his mom worked double shifts. Used to walk him to school, iron his clothes, help him with his homework. When his daddy died, she was the one that sat up with him until he stopped shaking. You all keep calling this a private service. Well, if she ain't family, then who is? A pause hung heavy in the room. People didn't know where to look. Then someone from the back muttered, "That can't be true." It was Michael's cousin, a man with a short beard and a pressed button-down shirt. "I don't remember her," he added. "If she was that close, how come nobody knew her?" Deshawn didn't blink. Maybe because nobody asked. That shut the man up. Quick. Evelyn didn't speak. She didn't need to. She just stood there, the white rose still in her hand. A symbol, plain as it was, of someone who showed up not to be seen, but to say goodbye. Michael's mother slowly turned around in her pew. Her eyes were red, her mouth thin and trembling. "Is that you, Miss Evelyn?" Her voice cracked at the edges. Evelyn nodded. "It's me, Liana." You could feel it then. Recognition slowly replacing judgment. A lifetime packed into a name. Liana rose to her feet. Her knees buckled slightly, but she steadied herself. "I didn't know you were here," she said. "I didn't want to intrude," Evelyn answered softly. "Just wanted to leave a flower and go." Liana took a shaky breath, looked around the room, then back at her son's casket. "Michael used to say you made the best cornbread in Alabama. He used to cry when he couldn't stay at your house." Evelyn smiled, just barely. "He used to hide his green beans under the napkin when he thought I wasn't looking." Liana gave a weak laugh that quickly turned into a sob. "You were always there. I was too tired to notice sometimes. But you were there." Deshawn stepped back, letting them see each other. Then Liana did something no one expected. She reached out and took Evelyn's hand. "Come sit with me," she said. "Please." Evelyn paused. The room watched. But then she gave a small nod and walked toward the front pew. As she sat, the church remained quiet, like everyone was waiting for permission to breathe again. And just like that, the woman who had been turned away moments earlier now sat beside the grieving mother of the man she helped raise. No fanfare, no apology from the usher, just a seat that always should have been hers. Deshawn remained standing. He scanned the room once more, then walked slowly to the side wall, arms folded behind him. He didn't say another word. He didn't need to. The message had landed. But even as Evelyn sat beside Liana, her mind wandered to the past. The years no one had seen, the small moments that built the man now lying in that casket. Evelyn sat quietly, her hands folded over her lap, the white rose still tucked gently between her fingers. The hum of the organ in the background barely registered in her ears. Liana wept beside her, a tissue balled in one hand, but Evelyn's thoughts were far from the stained glass windows and flower arrangements. They were back in her kitchen on Jefferson Street. Michael had been 5 the first time she saw him truly break. It was a Tuesday, raining hard, and he'd come in soaked, dragging his little backpack behind him. No coat, no umbrella, his socks squished in his shoes. His mother had been working 2 shifts back to back, and the neighbor who was supposed to walk him home had forgotten. He didn't cry. Not right away. He just sat down on the floor, right by the radiator, and stared at nothing. Evelyn had crouched down and pulled off his shoes, peeled off his socks, and wrapped his feet in an old towel. Then she knelt next to him. "Cold?" she asked. He shrugged. "Don't matter." That was the first time she saw it. That hard little edge in his voice. The kind kids shouldn't have. "You matter," she said, just like that. Not with a raised voice, not with a lecture. Just a soft fact. He blinked at her, and the tears came fast. She didn't ask him why he was crying. She didn't need to. Instead, she stood, lifted him like he weighed nothing, and sat with him on the couch. She held him until his breathing slowed, and the rain let up. That was the beginning. From that day on, Michael never called her Miss Evelyn. He called her Nana, like it was the most natural thing in the world. And though she never had children of her own, the name fit her like a second skin. She went to his school plays, sat in the gym during his basketball games, even though he mostly warmed the bench, helped him with book reports, bought him his first dress shirt for church, cooked his favorite meals, fried catfish and grits, peach cobbler on Sundays. She kept his secrets and reminded him when to speak up. And when he started thinking about joining the military, it was Evelyn who gave him the courage. "You got more bravery in you than you realize," she'd said. "Not 'cause you fight, 'cause you care." He had smiled and told her, "I'll make you proud, Nana," and he did. Every time he wrote her from deployment, she read his letters like scripture. He'd start everyone with, "Dear Nana," and end with, "Tell everyone I'm okay, but especially you." She remembered the last letter, too. It had arrived 2 weeks before the army chaplain knocked on her door. It was folded neatly, still smelled faintly of cologne. He had written, "I miss your cornbread and your stories. I'm not scared, Nana. I just wish I could see you one more time." Evelyn had read it twice that day, then put it in the drawer next to her Bible. And now, here she was, sitting beside his casket, no one at first knowing who she was. Invisible, until Deshawn pulled her into the light. She felt the stairs had changed now. They weren't cold anymore. People were seeing her, really seeing her, not just as the old lady with a rose, but as someone who belonged. She looked at the framed photo of Michael near the altar, in uniform, smiling. That same lopsided grin he had when he was 12 and beat Deshawn at checkers for the first time. He had made her proud, but more than that, he had carried her love all the way to the battlefield and back. He had turned the quiet care she gave him into strength, discipline, and compassion. Not everyone knew that part of his story. Now they would. Liana leaned closer, voice barely audible. "I should have called you sooner. Should have. Something." Evelyn didn't flinch. "You did what you had to do. We all just try to keep going." Liana wiped her eyes again, then placed her hand over Evelyn's. "I'm glad you came." Evelyn looked down at their hands. The contrast of old and older, of worn skin and shared grief. She nodded once. "So am I." But while the church settled into silence again, Evelyn's memories weren't done. There were still moments no one had seen, pieces of Michael's life she alone carried. The preacher's voice rose and fell in waves, quoting scripture and stitching comfort into the room with soft-toned words. People nodded politely, wiped tears, reached for tissues. But Evelyn wasn't hearing him. Her eyes were on the floor, her thoughts wrapped in a timeline that nobody in that church besides her could trace. She remembered one winter when Michael was about 8 and his coat zipper broke. His mother didn't have time to fix it, so Evelyn took it home after school and stitched a new one in, straight and steady. She stayed up until midnight, working it by hand. The next day, Michael wrapped himself in the coat like it was armor and grinned. "Looks brand new," he said. That same day, he got into a fight at school. A boy had said something slick, called Evelyn his maid. Michael threw the first punch and ended up suspended for 3 days. But when he came home, bruised and angry, he told her, "He doesn't get to talk about you like that." Evelyn had scolded him, sure, but inside, something swelled. Not pride in the fight, pride in the loyalty. She'd never told Liana about that incident, didn't see the point in causing tension. But the truth was, Michael had always seen her, even when no one else did. The funny thing about being someone's second mother is that you carry the memories quietly. There's no scrapbook, no title, just a string of silent moments stitched across years. She remembered tying his necktie for prom, helping him rehearse a speech for a community youth program when he was 17, being the first person he told when he got his acceptance letter to the Army's basic training program. He didn't call his mom first. He walked over to Evelyn's apartment, waved the envelope in the air, and shouted through her screen door, "Nana, I got in!" She had hugged him so tight that day, afraid to show she was scared. The world was changing, and war was never a clean thing. But she didn't stop him. She only said, "Keep your heart soft, even when the job's hard." And he did. When the letters stopped coming last month, she thought maybe he was busy. Maybe his unit had moved. She hadn't watched the news since spring. Too many headlines, too many things she couldn't change. But then the knock came. 2 soldiers, both young, one looking barely out of high school. They were kind, but formal. They called her ma'am, and handed her a flag folded so sharp it looked like it might cut her fingers. They didn't know who she was. She wasn't listed as next of kin. But someone had added her name to a delivery list, and that was something. She had held the flag in both hands and stared at it for a long time, unsure if it belonged in the living room or in the drawer with his letters. Now, watching the preacher speak about sacrifice and service, about how Michael had died protecting his team, Evelyn felt something deep in her chest. Not grief. It had already carved itself into her. Something else. A kind of stillness. Because this was the moment she had dreaded and prepared for all at once. She'd told Michael once, when he was 13 and scared of the dark, "Nothing we love ever really leaves us. It just shifts places." And sitting there, in that front pew where she almost hadn't been allowed to sit, Evelyn felt him. Not as a soldier, not as a photo, but as the boy who used to fall asleep on her couch halfway through Jeopardy. The one who never learned to whistle, who ate cereal dry out of the box, who left his socks on her porch no matter how many times she fussed. That was the Michael she carried, the one no eulogy could fully describe. A hand brushed her elbow. Deshawn again. Quiet. Respectful. "I'm glad you came," he whispered. She looked at him. "You brought me back in." He smiled. "I just told the truth." But as the service continued, something else was coming. Something that would pull the whole room into the heart of the story, whether they were ready or not. The preacher closed his Bible, gave a solemn nod, and stepped back from the podium. The choir began humming again, low and steady, the kind of harmony that sat heavy in the chest. Most people thought the service was winding down. That's when Deshawn stood up. He didn't make a show of it. He just rose from the side wall, adjusted his sleeves, and walked up to the front. The room fell quiet as he approached the microphone. He looked young standing there, clean-cut, proud, but carrying something behind his eyes that didn't come from age. He cleared his throat and glanced over at Evelyn. She met his gaze, gave him the tiniest nod. That was all he needed. "I didn't plan to speak today," he began, voice calm but steady. "But after what just happened outside, I realized there's more to say. Things people need to hear. Things I can't keep quiet anymore." He paused, looked at the faces in the pews, some curious, some tense. "I met Sergeant Landry once. Just once. But he saved my life. I was in his unit. We were pinned down, under fire, scared out of our minds. Michael didn't flinch. He acted. He pulled 3 of us out, didn't think twice." A few heads nodded slowly. "But that's not why I'm standing here. I'm here because before he became Sergeant Landry, before the medals and the uniform, he was just Michael, and someone had to help raise that boy. That someone was Miss Evelyn." He looked over at her again. "She's not blood. She's not listed in any documents. But she's the reason he knew what love looked like, what sacrifice meant. She taught him how to be the kind of man who runs toward danger to protect others." He paused again, this time longer. "I used to go to her house after school. My mum worked long hours, and Miss Evelyn, she stepped in. I was a loud kid, always hungry, always asking questions. She never turned me away." The crowd listened. Still, she made sure we were clean, fed, and respectful. She gave us more than food. She gave us steadiness. When I struggled in school, she sat beside me. When I felt like nothing, she reminded me I wasn't. Deshawn took a breath, shoulders stiffening slightly. "But you know what hurt me today? Seeing her turned away. Seeing her treated like a stranger at a funeral she should have been planning, not just attending." A few people looked down. Others glanced at one another uncomfortably. This church is full of folks who knew Michael from a distance. But this woman? She knew him when he still had missing teeth and scraped knees. She knew the sound of his laugh when he was 10. She was his safe place before he ever wore boots. He scanned the front row again, then the back. "You can't rewrite who raised you. You can't ignore the hands that held you up just because they don't share your last name." The room was silent. A few people had tears in their eyes now. Liana was crying quietly, tissue pressed to her mouth. "I get it," Deshawn said finally. "Sometimes we don't mean to forget. Life gets busy. People move on. But today, we remember. We honor." He stepped back from the mic. No applause followed, just quiet. The kind of silence that lingers when truth has just hit the room square in the chest. Evelyn didn't move. She looked down at the rose in her lap, her fingers still gently resting on its stem. The usher from earlier stood at the side, shoulders hunched slightly. His face was tight with regret, though he didn't speak. He didn't need to. He looked like he wanted to disappear. A woman from the third pew reached into her purse and pulled out a small white envelope. She walked up to Evelyn and handed it to her without a word. Inside was a photo. Young Michael, no older than 9, standing in front of Evelyn's old porch. She remembered the day clearly. He had just won a spelling bee. The woman smiled faintly. "I found it in my mama's drawer last week. Thought it was just some neighbor kid. Now I know." Evelyn clutched the photo gently. "Thank you," she said, voice barely above a whisper. But something still hadn't been said. Something Michael himself had written, and it was about to surface in a way no one expected. The moment Deshawn stepped down, the air shifted again. Not tense, just heavy with everything unsaid. You could feel people sitting straighter, listening harder, rethinking everything they thought they knew about Sergeant Michael Landry's life. From her seat on the front pew, Evelyn held the photo in her lap. She stared at it as if the boy in the picture might suddenly speak. His smile was toothy, his ears still too big for his head. Behind him was the chipped paint of her porch and the battered metal mailbox Michael used to stuff with drawings and little notes. She used to save those notes. And now here she was, decades later, hearing others finally speak about her like she mattered. The preacher, an older man with tired eyes, cleared his throat and stepped back to the microphone. "Miss Evelyn," he said gently. "We didn't know. I didn't know." He shook his head slowly. "Sometimes we get so caught up in titles, mother, cousin, brother, we forget what really defines family. Thank you for showing us what love looks like in real life." Then he looked to Liana. "Would you like to say a few words before we close?" Liana sat still for a moment. Her fingers fidgeted with the edge of her skirt. Then she stood. She didn't walk to the front. She stayed right there beside Evelyn. "I used to tell people I raised Michael on my own," she began, voice hoarse. "Single mother. Long hours. Small apartment. I told myself I did the best I could, but I left out a big part of the truth." She reached for Evelyn's hand. "This woman kept my son steady when I couldn't. She fed him when I was scraping by. She calmed him when I didn't have the words. She filled in the cracks I was too tired to see." Evelyn looked away, her eyes glassy. Liana continued. "He called her Nana, and I let him, because deep down, I knew she was helping build him into the man he became." She paused and took a shaky breath. "But I didn't say thank you. Not then. Not after. I let time and pride and busyness cover what should have been said." A tear slid down her cheek. "I'm sorry." Evelyn shook her head softly. "You don't owe me sorry," she said, finally speaking. "You did what you had to. We both did." Then she looked up. "I didn't do it for thanks. I did it because he needed somebody, and because I loved that boy like he was mine." For the first time all day she let a tear fall, just one, but it said more than 1,000 words could. The preacher nodded respectfully and stepped back toward the podium. "There's one more thing," he said. "Michael left behind a sealed letter. It wasn't addressed to anyone specifically, but now I think we know who it was meant for." He reached into a small folder and carefully unfolded the letter. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. He cleared his throat and began to read aloud. "If anything happens to me, don't cry for long. I lived like I wanted. I went where I was needed. And if you're reading this, I want you to know something important. The person who taught me what it means to care, to stand tall, to never back down from what's right. That person isn't wearing medals or giving speeches. She had tired feet, strong hands, and a voice that always made me feel safe. She knew how to fix buttons, calm fears, and find the good in anybody. I hope she knows that I took her with me everywhere. Every decision, every mission, I thought of her. If I didn't say it enough, I love you, Nana. Thank you for raising me, for being my home." The letter trembled in the preacher's hands. He folded it back up and held it out toward Evelyn. She didn't rush. She didn't cry again. She just reached out and took it with the kind of care you give to something sacred. A murmur rippled through the pews. Not gossip, but reverence. The people in that church would never forget her again. But what happened after the service, outside, beneath the still summer sky, would become the final piece of this story. A moment of quiet redemption no one saw coming. After the service ended, the crowd began to drift out of the church. Some filtered into the parking lot. Others lingered in small clusters, whispering about the letter, about the woman they nearly ignored. The sun had crept out from behind the clouds, but it didn't bring comfort, only heat on their backs and the weight of reflection. Evelyn stood up slowly. Her knees ached, but she didn't complain. She held the folded letter close, tucked against her chest, like something too fragile to keep in a pocket. Liana stood beside her and gently reached for her arm. "Let me walk with you," she said. Evelyn hesitated, just for a second, then nodded. They stepped outside together, and as they moved toward the sidewalk, more people began to notice. A young woman from the choir approached them first. She looked no older than 22, her eyes swollen from crying. I didn't know who you were," she said to Evelyn, voice trembling. "But I sang today because of what Michael wrote about you. I read some of his journals last year. He talked about you all the time. He said you were the strongest person he'd ever met." Evelyn blinked. "He did?" The young woman nodded. "Said you didn't raise your voice, but people listened when you spoke. Said your hands never rested, but you never complained." Evelyn smiled softly. "He noticed that, huh?" Behind them, Deshawn stepped outside, looking around. He spotted the two women and joined them at the curb. "You okay?" he asked. "I'm all right, baby," Evelyn said. "Tired." He glanced down at the letter in her hand. "You gonna frame it?" Evelyn chuckled. "Maybe. Or keep it in the drawer next to his old spelling bee ribbon. That drawer's getting crowded." People began to approach in twos and threes. Neighbors, old classmates of Michael, a few soldiers in uniform. Some shared memories. Others simply offered their hands. Nobody brought up her age. Nobody asked why she hadn't been mentioned in the program. They didn't need to anymore. Then came the usher from earlier, the man in the navy blue suit who had turned her away. His steps were cautious, his eyes on the ground until he stood directly in front of her. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't know." Evelyn studied him. Not with anger, but with something deeper. Disappointment. Then she simply nodded. "You know now," she said. He seemed relieved she didn't say more. But in truth, she didn't need to. The weight of his mistake would sit with him longer than any speech she could have given. Deshawn turned to her after he walked away. "You handled that better than I would have." "I've had practice," she said. "You live long enough. You learn." The walk back to Jefferson Street was slow. Deshawn offered to drive Evelyn home, but she refused. "My legs still work," she said with a wink. "And I know the cracks in this sidewalk better than most folks know their own names." So they walked. Evelyn, Liana, and Deshawn. The sun sat high now, baking the pavement and casting long shadows ahead of them. Traffic was light. A breeze stirred the air, just enough to move the corners of the letter still clutched in Evelyn's hand. When they reached her apartment building, the familiar creak of the rusted gate greeted them. The front steps were chipped, the paint on the railing faded and peeling. But to Evelyn, it looked just the way it always had. Like home. She climbed the steps carefully. At the top, she turned and gestured for Deshawn and Liana to follow. "You'll better come in. I've got iced tea in the fridge, and I can't drink it all by myself." They didn't argue. Inside, the apartment was small but tidy. The curtains were thin, letting in warm streaks of light. On one side of the living room sat an old couch covered with a crocheted blanket. On the other was a shelf filled with framed photos. Kids. Neighbors. One of Michael at 17, arms folded, standing on the front porch in a pair of too big jeans. Evelyn walked straight to a small wooden box on the coffee table. She opened it slowly and placed Michael's letter inside, along with the bronze star. Then she closed the lid and rested her hand on top for a moment. "I used to keep ribbons and drawings in there," she said. "Now it holds weight." Liana sat down on the couch, still looking around the room. I don't think I ever came inside. Michael used to talk about this place all the time, but I guess I never slowed down enough to come see it. Evelyn didn't respond right away. She was watching Deshawn, who had walked over to the shelf of photos. "Is that me?" he asked, pointing to a picture of two boys grinning in front of a birthday cake. "It is," Evelyn said. "You had just pushed Michael's face in the cake after he dared you." He laughed. "I remember that. He chased me with a plastic fork for the rest of the day." The three of them sat together, letting the past drift around them like sunlight. The kind of silence that didn't ask to be filled. Then Evelyn stood again and walked toward a drawer near the kitchen. "There's something else," she said. "Something Michael left behind." She opened the drawer and pulled out a smaller envelope, worn at the corners, with Nana written in thick, uneven handwriting. "I found this a week after the soldiers came. It was tucked inside one of his old shoeboxes I kept." She held it for a long moment before handing it to Deshawn. "You read it," she said. He took the envelope carefully and slid the letter out. His eyes scanned the words. After a pause, he began reading aloud. "Dear Nana, if anything ever happens to me, don't sit alone too long. Don't let people forget you. You were my beginning, and no matter where I went, I carried your voice with me. You used to tell me I'd grow into my shoes. I didn't know you meant life too. You made me brave, even when you were scared. You taught me that strong doesn't mean loud, and that love don't always come with a name tag. If folks ever look past you, tell them this. You raised a man who mattered, a man who tried, a man who remembered where he came from. Don't cry, Nana. Or if you do, cry proud. I'll see you again someday, and I'll bring your sweet tea with me." Deshawn lowered the letter slowly, voice tight with emotion. Evelyn said nothing at first. She just sat, her hands resting in her lap. Then she looked up and smiled. "Stubborn until the end," she said. Liana reached over and squeezed her hand. "You gave him everything." Evelyn shook her head gently. "He gave it back." But even as the day settled and shadows stretched across the floor, the lesson behind Michael's words still lingered, waiting to be said out loud, because there was one more thing left to understand. Later that evening, after Liana and Deshawn had left and the apartment quieted again, Evelyn sat by the window with a glass of tea in her hand and the letter on her lap. The street outside was still, the kind of still that made every sound, distant barking, the creak of a porch swing, the rattle of a loose gate, feel louder, clearer, heavier. She glanced down at Michael's words, now read a dozen times but still full of weight, and she thought, he knew, he always knew. For so many years, Evelyn had given quietly. She'd raised children who weren't hers, cooked meals for families who didn't always say thank you, sat through school meetings as the neighbor or helper without being asked if she wanted a chair at the table. And somehow that had become her place, valuable, but invisible, needed, but never quite recognized. Until today. Not because she demanded it, not because she forced anyone to look, but because love has a way of writing its own truth, and eventually that truth stands up, like Deshawn had, like Michael did with every act of kindness he gave in a uniform built on values he learned in a kitchen on Jefferson Street. Evelyn stood, slowly, and walked back over to the little wooden box on her table. She opened it once more. Inside were things no museum would want. Old notes, a crayon drawing, a bent house key, now joined by a bronze star, and a letter from a man the world saluted. She added one more thing, her name, written on a small slip of paper. She placed it on top of everything else, because her story mattered too. The next morning, she called the local school and offered to volunteer as a reader for the first grade class. When the secretary asked, "Do you have a student enrolled?" Evelyn smiled. "Not anymore, but I've raised a few." A week later, the local paper ran a short piece under the community section. "Unsung hero honored at local soldier's funeral." It was a small article, just 3 paragraphs long. But it named her, not as a neighbor, not as a visitor. As Nana Evelyn Johnson, the woman who helped raise Sergeant Michael Landry and a generation of children who called her home. It didn't bring her fame. It didn't erase the decades of being overlooked. But it meant something, because now other people would remember too. Now her story wouldn't disappear in the silence. And maybe that was the lesson the funeral tried to teach everyone there, the one they almost missed. That love isn't always loud, that family isn't always listed, and that behind every strong man or woman is someone who gave without keeping score. Not everyone who shapes a life wears a title. Some just show up, day after day, without thanks, without cameras, without parades, but their fingerprints, they last forever. As the sun dipped behind the trees and cast gold light across her porch, Evelyn sat with her tea and whispered to no one in particular, "I told you I'd outlive you, didn't I, boy?" She smiled and leaned back in her chair. The letter rested on her lap. The rose had long since wilted in a small vase beside her, and still, she was holding on. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone in your life who loved quietly, who gave without asking, who stood behind you when no one else did, then tell their story. Say their name, because silence is where too many good lives get lost. And today, we broke that silence for one. Subscribe for more stories that honor the unseen, the unheard, and the unforgettable. Would you like to change anything in the conclusion or final message?